So for this presentation today, does Marxism even matter? Capital and history. I'd just like to read out the description. In the mid-19th century, Marx and Engels observed in the Communist Manifesto that a specter was haunting Europe, the specter of communism. A century and a half later, it is Marxism itself that continues to haunt the left, while capitalism remains. What does it mean that Marx and Marxism still appeal, while political movements for socialism are weak or non-existent? What were Marxism's original points of departure for considering radical possibilities for freedom that might still speak to the present? How does Marxism still matter? So without further ado, I'll pass it on to the presenter.
Thanks very much. My name is James Vaughan. I'm a senior member of Platypus. Thanks for coming today, and thanks to Desmond and Clay for organizing things. Let me begin with two kind of throat-clearing remarks. The first is that today I'm going to be presenting kind of deep background to classical Marxism. And such a development let me put it this way, dialectical development, I'm going to be presenting schematically, which means I can't possibly do it justice. Now, this is not some sort of immodesty on my part. It is impossible to present such a dialectical development schematically. So, but yeah, I will try and give it, the old college try, as they say. And what I want to put to you is my aim here is not to convince you, but rather to maybe try and interest you in what I'm talking about, and in being so interested, to encourage you to come to the Platypus reading group that Desmond just announced, the Marxism reading group that runs throughout the academic year. Because it's really the kind of historical imagination, the kind of social and political sensibility that I'm trying to present the background for today can only really be unfolded and unpacked and meaningfully discussed in the context of that reading group over the course of the academic year. So I just want to say again, my aim today is not to convince you, but to say, maybe interest you. And if you are so interested, however skeptical you may be, however many doubts you might have, you would go to the Platypus Marxism reading group and see there the kind of historical, social, political sensibility and imagination that develops as a participant in that reading group. The second thing I want to say is that I am not a technologically sophisticated person. I had some printing difficulties, so I'm going to be reading some quotes on my phone, and that means I'll be fumbling occasionally. So for that, I apologize. So what I want to do today is to pick up where Desmond left off in the introduction, which is to talk about Marxism's point of departure, meaning not so much the actual history of actually existing Marxism from the later 19th century to today, insofar as it still exists, if it still exists, but rather what it took for granted. What were its most basic assumptions about the world, both the contemporary world that it inhabited in the later 19th and 20th century, but what I will really emphasize today, how that world came into being, and what about that world came into being opened up possibilities for further developments that Marxism sought to provoke consciousness of, a collective historical consciousness of. So today is a kind of grand meta-narrative, if you will. That's a kind of a postmodernist term of abuse, but nevertheless, I will inhabit that term. I'm going to be offering you a grand narrative, a kind of Marxist philosophy of history about capital in history. And I want to say one last thing before I get into the details, which I'm going to use the word ancient as opposed to modern. And by ancient as opposed to modern, I simply mean ancient as pre-modern. That is to say, more or less, the whole world before, let's say, roughly, just for the sake of argument, the year 1500. So I'm going to be using these words ancient and modern. And by ancient, I don't mean, say, what many of you might be familiar with, the classical Greco-Roman past, sort of classical antiquity. I mean the entirety of the pre-modern world throughout recorded history, going back 10,000 years, okay? So that's what I mean. I want to begin with two quotes. The first is by Karl Marx himself, and the second is by Louis Menand reflecting back on Karl Marx and his greatest intellectual collaborator, Friedrich Engels. The Marx quote is from his manuscripts of setting up capital called the Grundrisse, and here's the quote. "What is progress, if not the absolute elaboration of humanity's creative dispositions? unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself, the absolute movement of becoming. The ancient conception, or the pre-modern conception, in which man always appears in however narrowly national, religious, or political a definition as the aim of production, seems very much more exalted than the modern world, in which production is the aim of man and wealth the aim of production. In fact, however, when the narrow bourgeois form has been peeled away, what is wealth if not the universality of needs, capacities, enjoyments, productive powers, etc., of individuals produced in universal exchange? What if not the full development of human control over the forces of nature, those of his own nature as well as those of so-called nature? What if not the absolute elaboration of his creative dispositions without any preconditions other than antecedent historical evolution, which make the totality of this evolution, i.e. the evolution of all human powers as such, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself? What is this if not a situation where man does not reproduce in any determined form, but produces his totality, where he does not seek to remain something formed by the past, but is in the absolute movement of becoming? In bourgeois political economy, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete elaboration of what lies within man appears as the total alienation and the destruction of all fixed, one-sided purposes, as the sacrifice of the end in itself to a wholly external compulsion. Hence, in one way, the childlike world of the ancients, or the pre-moderns, appears to be superior. And this is so insofar as we seek for closed shape, form, and established limitation. The ancients provide a narrow satisfaction, whereas the modern world leaves us unsatisfied, or where it appears to be satisfied with itself is vulgar and mean. Right? The modern world leaves us deeply unsatisfied, and where it comes to be satisfied with itself, it's vulgar and mean. So I want to unpack that, but before doing so, I'd like to pair it with another quote from Louis Menand, and I hope you'll forgive my fumbling here. There was a re-release of a very famous book by Edmund Wilson called To the Finland Station a couple of decades ago now, and when it was re-released, Louis Menand, a famous literary critic, novelist, wrote an introduction to it, a new introduction. And here's what he wrote. In pre-modern societies, the ends of life are given at the beginning of life. People do things in their generation so that the same things will continue to be done in the next generation. Meaning is imminent in all the ordinary customs and practices of existence, since these are inherited from the past and are therefore worth reproducing. The idea is to make the world go not forward, only around. In modern societies, the ends of life are not given at the beginning of life. They are thought to be created or discovered. The reproduction of the customs and practices of the group is no longer the chief purpose of existence. The idea is not to repeat, but to change, to move the world forward. Meaning is no longer imminent in the practices of ordinary life, since those practices are understood by everyone to be contingent and time-bound. This is why death in modern societies is the great taboo, an absurdity, the worst thing one can imagine. For at the close of life, people cannot look back and know that they have accomplished the tasks set for them at birth. This knowledge always lies up ahead, somewhere over history's horizon. Modern societies don't know what will count as valuable in the conduct of the long run. Modern societies don't know what will count as valuable in the conduct of life in the long run, because they have no way of knowing what conduct the long run will find itself in a position to respect. The only certain knowledge death comes with is the knowledge that the value of one's own time, the values one has tried to live by, are expungible. Marxism, and here's the really key part, gave a meaning to modernity. It said that, wittingly or not, the individual performs a role in a drama that has a shape and a goal, a trajectory, and that modernity will turn out to be just one act in that drama. Historical change is not arbitrary. It is generated by class conflict. It is faithful to an inner logic. It points towards an end, which is the establishment of the classless society. Marxism was founded on an appeal for social justice, but there were many forms that such an appeal might have taken. Its deeper attraction was the discovery of meaning, a meaning in which human beings might participate in history itself. When Edmund Wilson explained in his introduction to the 1972 edition of To the Finland Station that his book had been written under the assumption, quote, that an important step in progress has been made, that a fundamental breakthrough had occurred, this is the faith he was referring to. Marx and Engels were the philosophers of a Second Enlightenment. And so I kind of want to unpack both those quotes now by setting it in the context of a kind of grand narrative or a meta-narrative, however you want to describe it. And as I enter into it, I just want to say something about these terms, being and becoming, that can also maybe be comprehended as nature and spirit. In Platypus, we generally mean those in the German sense of nature, which is to say the world as it is, the world you are born into. Not simply the natural world or what we might call the environment or an ecological system, but the world as it is, as it's been shaped by culture, civilization, humanity over centuries and indeed millennia. So nature is the world as it is, the world you are born into, the world that deeply shapes you. And spirit or Geist, right, is the possible becoming of something new, potentiality. What ought or what might, what is possible to be. Okay, so I just want to think about those terms or put those terms out there, being and becoming and nature and spirit. And I also want to talk about Manon saying Marx and Engels are philosophers of a Second Enlightenment. That's true, but it begs the question, what was the First Enlightenment? And it's important to understand what the First Enlightenment was, but also how Marx and Engels, being the philosophers of the Second Enlightenment, is quite different. So essentially, I'm going to try and unpack all of that in a meta-narrative that I'll now move into of history. Roughly about 300,000 years ago, right, Homo sapiens fully emerged, right, traveled out of the continent of Africa and populated the whole of the earth. And these Homo sapiens that so populated the world exhibited an extremely complex form of social interdependence. They were extremely, radically transformative of the natural world around them. The form that social interdependence took, those social relations, and by social relations I don't simply mean relations between people, relations between you and me, but relations between humans and nature, relations among and between humans themselves, and the human relation to oneself, right, and to subjectivity within. So by social relations, I mean relations to nature, to others, and to yourself. The dominant form that human social relations took was nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, right? Small, mobile groups of hunter-gatherers that began to transform the world more than other animal species. About roughly 10,000 years ago, groups of nomadic hunter-gatherers in different areas of the world basically settled down. They became settled agriculturalists, peasants and farmers. They were no longer mobile, but rather became static, and they transformed a particular part of the earth which they cultivated and gave rise to very complex agricultural systems. This was called roughly the Neolithic Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution. And that is the move away from nomadic hunter-gathering, right, or Paleolithic life, to Neolithic life, settled agriculture. And eventually, those settled agricultural communities that began to rise 10,000 years ago became extremely transformative of the areas they had settled in. Their agriculture, their crop rotation, their animal husbandry became incredibly complex and sophisticated, and they were able to draw more out of the earth than previous generations of peasants and farmers, their elders, their ancestors could. And a surplus developed, and people moved off. A section of the population was able to move off the land and into literally towns, villages, cities, and perform things other than immediate subsistence agriculture, immediate peasant agriculture. This gave rise, right, to civilization, the life of the cities. And this gave rise to an order of caste society, right? That there was not a single human society or a single humanity, but rather humanity was born into different castes. These take different structures. Obviously, there's the famous 5-part caste of medieval India, beginning with the Brahmins, the kind of priestly caste. But for my purposes, because I'm going to eventually talk about the rise of bourgeois society, I'll just talk about the European caste system, the tripartite caste system. Those who work, those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. The priestly caste, the noble caste or warrior caste, and the workers, everybody else, right? So essentially, settled agriculture eventually gave rise to civilization, and civilization included complex caste formations, right? And essentially, in these civilizations, for all of their diversity, whether we're talking about medieval India, or Pharaonic Egypt, or Aztec Mexico, or medieval Christian Europe, essentially, what they have at their core is not simply, right, that they're caste orders, and devoted to largely subsistence agriculture, but it's also the case, right, that they essentially, these civilizations, are a much greater form of social interdependency and complexity than had existed under previous nomadic hunter-gathering groups. They, to a much greater degree, transform the world around them, right? They leave things like what we now call megaliths. They leave huge monuments, right? Monuments of civilization. They transform to a much greater extent the world around them, and their subsequent generations inherit not just simply the earth, but a much greater transformed by human activity and practice world, if that makes sense. All right? And that was essentially, right, the dominant form of life for the past 10,000 years, for what we call recorded history. And in those different forms of life, there were concepts of freedom. There were concepts of determining oneself, if you will. But those concepts of freedom, for all their diversity, shared a basic ancient conception or pre-modern conception, which was that the purposes of life are given at the beginning of life. You are meant to be what you are born into in life, okay? So for ancient slave revolts, if you think of slave revolts in the Roman Empire, right? The tragedy is being removed from your birth condition, from being a farmer or a warrior elsewhere, by Roman conquerors or by other conquerors, and sold into the slave markets of the ancient Mediterranean world. And when you break your chains, you don't seek to end slavery as such. You seek to return to the world that you were meant to inhabit, the world that you were meant to be, who you were born to be, right? You were born to be a farmer, born to be a warrior, born to be a carpenter. So the ancient conception of freedom is that you fulfill the role that you were meant to fulfill at birth, right? And that's why, if you think of medieval Europe, there are many names like Smith and Carpenter. And that's because people in those families were born into journeymen, apprentices, masters in medieval guilds, and meant to themselves become carpenters, smiths, etc. Okay, that was the ancient conception of freedom. About roughly between, let's say, 200 and 500 years ago. So I apologize, I don't have anything to write with, so I'm just asking you to kind of use your imagination. I've been speaking at the level of the past 10,000 years of recorded history. But if you now think of roughly 200 to 500 years ago, so roughly between 1500 of the Common Era to roughly 1800 of the Common Era, there's a profound crisis of civilization. And that crisis entails the rise and development of what classical Marxism referred to as bourgeois society. Now, bourgeois society, I want to say a few things about that. There is no way, this is not intended to be a history lecture, there's no way in which I can get into the details of why civilization which had been developing globally for tens of thousands of years, began to go into a profound crisis in certain sections of the world, mostly the North Atlantic world, between roughly 1500 and 1800. But to make a very long story short, a whole series of complex developments, including the collapse of serfdom or unfree labor in Western Europe, the development of the Renaissance, the development of the Protestant Reformation and the breakup of medieval Christendom, and the breakup of one Europe under the Roman Catholic Church, the discoveries of the New World by Europeans for Europeans, and the discovery of the maritime passage around the southern tip of Africa that directly connected Europe and Asia like they had never been before overland. These things built on one another, right? They all have different origins. They're not part of some inevitable historical logic. There are many contingencies entailed in the collapse of serfdom and the development of free labor in the Renaissance, the rediscovery of the classical past, in the discovery of the New World out there in the sense of, for Western Europeans, the Americas, the direct maritime passage to Asia, in the Reformation and the breakup of Latin Christendom. But all of these produce a great deal of instability, a profound deal of instability, and the verities, the certainties of traditional civilization, of the ancient conception of freedom as it had been expressed in the westernmost tip of the Eurasian landmass, which we call Eurasia, they collapsed. They were to many people simply no longer plausible or convincing. And I want to stress this. Civilization had been global development for 10,000 years, and the crisis of civilization, the development of bourgeois society, is itself a global development, but it plays out like civilization itself did in particular areas of the world earlier. And civilization, medieval Christian civilization, really collapses between the 14th, 15th, and 18th centuries in Western Europe. And we see a kind of instability that gives rise to bourgeois society. Now, I have to truncate a lot of developments here, but there is an entire, what we might call, grand development of enlightenment from roughly René Descartes in the mid-17th century, and that's much more earlier than most people would be comfortable dating it, through to Immanuel Kant at the end of the 18th century. But that kind of development in philosophy and knowledge, right, is broadly an attempt to make sense of this new world that's coming to being, this undermining of the verities and certainties of traditional medieval Christian civilization, and this trying to understand what's going on around them and to make sense of it. And so there is an ongoing social transformation, and the later Enlightenment of the late 17th and 18th century is an attempt to make sense of that transformation. And in making sense of it, to bring it into greater consciousness so people might realize potentialities within it that have not been fully developed. So one has to think about the rise of bourgeois society and the Enlightenment as mutually informing one another. There would have been no Enlightenment on the western mass of Eurasia in Western Europe absent the development of bourgeois society, but likewise, further potentialities and possibilities in the development of bourgeois society become evident through the Enlightenment, making available to the reading public. Okay, so broadly, what happens by the later 17th and 18th centuries, you have a developing bourgeois society. Now I want to say something about what this term bourgeois society means, okay? First off, bourgeois. Bourgeois does not mean the capitalists, right? Obviously, classical Marxism uses bourgeoisie to mean the capitalist class, the owner of the means of production, distribution, exchange, subsistence. But when classical Marxism refers to bourgeois society, they are not referring to the society of the bourgeoisie. That is really important. They are really referring to the first form of society as such, and it is a bourgeois society because it is a society that is urban and commercial. Now, I don't mean that between 1500 and 1800 in the Western world that everybody became a merchant or everybody moved into a town and city. That's preposterous. That development that the majority of humanity lives in towns and cities only, according to the UN Development Report, occurred around the early 21st century, 2001, 2002. Rather, what I'm speaking about is a certain experience of the world that could only take place in a late medieval or early modern city, right, in Western Europe. An experience of freedom, of dynamism, of mobility, of transformability, became generalized, okay? There was an old medieval expression, Stadt Luft macht frei. That is just German for town air makes one free, right? And the sensibility was an escaped serf, someone who could escape the unfree labor, the bondage, the quasi-slavery of serfdom, could escape into the city and could attempt, right, to begin to set the course of their own lives, rather than having the course of their life determined for them. And because of the collapse of traditional medieval Christian civilization in Western Europe, you essentially have a kind of general spreading of town air up and down the continent. That does not mean that everyone moves into towns and cities, rather that just in the way that ancient cities are really ruralized, they come from out of the country. The country is the real area of human activity as such. Modern life, modern cities, right, are essentially urbanize the countryside, right? They become nodes of a much more dynamic, fluid, self-determining existence. They're just the kind of cities that develop, or the kind of bourgeois experience I'm talking about, is a general experience. Because between 1500 and 1800, many people still inhabit, most people in fact, the countryside of Western Europe, but they're no longer serfs. They're increasingly free. They're increasingly entering into free exchange and social cooperation, voluntary and free social cooperation with one another. And that is a kind of generalization of town air, making people free, if you will. So, at the core of bourgeois society as it develops in the 17th and 18th centuries are the social relations of the commodity form of the exchange of labor. Put simply, at the core of bourgeois society, right, is the cooperation of free laborers, right? Social relations based on free labor, on the commodity form of labor. That essentially a much greater series of activities, society, the economy, things much greater than the sum of their parts, are coming into being from the free cooperation of people across the length and breadth of society. And that is giving rise to a dynamic development described in many different ways by the Enlightenment, most famously in the tradition of classical political economy from William Petty and Adam Smith, as the expansion of the division labor and the growth of the market. But there are many other ways one could talk about the development of the social relations of free labor, of this kind of dominion of free labor, if you will, that's expanding across the world. But I want to emphasize two, right? What we begin to see across entire domains of human existence, and I want to stress, the rise of bourgeois society is as important and fundamental a transformation in human social relations, in the way humans relate to one another, to themselves, and to nature, as was the agricultural revolution, the development of settled agriculture 10,000 years ago. It's a profound transformation in every domain of life, be it art, philosophy, economics, what have you, okay? And there begins to come into being with bourgeois society a new conception of freedom, a modern conception of freedom, right? Which is not the freedom to be what you were always meant to be, but the freedom to become something else that you might, in the course of your life, by yourself and with others, come together to determine the ends of your own existence. And other people will come to determine the ends of their own existence. And this will be a free development in continuous self-transformation where people decide freely the values to live by and set individually and collectively the course of their own existence. And this is really the modern conception of freedom. Not the freedom to be what you were always meant to be, but the freedom to become something you're not, to become something else in a kind of open-ended transformation. And this was in essence the promise of bourgeois society. And the Enlightenment reflecting on these much greater social, economic, cultural, political, religious transformations taking place in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, sought to raise to awareness the fact that such a transformation had taken place, that not only that society had transformed fundamentally in a profound way, but basically that human beings had always been involved in their self-production, that human beings had always determined themselves through and in forms of society. So when the Aztecs sacrificed the virgins, that is not commandments from gods or nature, but rather comes out of their own social organization. So the Enlightenment seek to provoke to consciousness and awareness that people, right, not only were that people determine themselves in and through society, and by doing so to make people realize that the greatest site of their self-determination, self-transformation was in society, and to open up the possibility that they could collectively transform them society and therefore make available to themselves as individuals and together collectively potentials and possibilities that they were unaware of. Right? So it's not simply the discovery, right, that we live, that is, the Enlightenment is not just the discovery that we live in a new form of human community, bourgeois society. It's the discovery that humans transform themselves in and through the forms of human community they live in, that the things they create themselves are the basis fundamentally of their own existence. And in understanding how that process takes place, they may be able to change it and open up the possibilities for developments that they do not yet foresee. And this really achieves its apogee in the later Enlightenment, the kind of Enlightenment that goes from the 1750s to more or less the early 19th century and concludes with the work of Hegel. And I want to read you a quote by the political scientist James Miller, because it's really Rousseau who sets this kind of radicalization of the Enlightenment, the radical awareness of the fact that human beings create themselves in and through society and may be able to transform the ways that they create themselves in society and open up possibilities undreamt of, okay? And apologize for my technological fumbling, guys, but I promise this will be the last quote I will read. Okay. The principle, this is again James Miller in his introduction to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. The principle of freedom and its corollary, perfectibility, suggests that the possibilities for being human are both multiple and literally endless. Contemporaries like Kant well understood the novelty and radical implication of Rousseau's new principle of freedom, and appreciated his unusual stress on history as the site where the true nature of our species is simultaneously realized and perverted, revealed and distorted. A new way of thinking about the human condition had appeared. As Hegel put it, the principle of freedom dawned on the world in Rousseau and gave infinite strength to man, who thus apprehended himself as infinite. Now, some things I want to say about this. There is a sense, right, because bourgeois society has as its core homo economicus, that is, bourgeois society is based on the urban worker, right? Bourgeois society is based on the free laborer. Whether that free labor exists as a commercial farmer or wage laborer in the countryside, or exists as a wage laborer in the town and city. Bourgeois society is based on the urban worker, and through free economic and social cooperation, through the development of the division of labor and the expansion of the market, that there will be a progressive transformation of human nature that will be maximally efficient, maximally productive, and for the least amount of labor, human beings will be able to transform the most amount of nature and have the most consumption, variety, and riches possible. That's at the core. Now, to us, to many people living after the crisis of bourgeois society, which I will end with, right, it can appear like that homo economicus, that kind of, that human that works and tries to be maximally productive and efficient to transform the world in cooperation with other people, is a kind of unfortunate machine that we do not anymore work to live, but rather live to work. But that's really not bourgeois society. That's really because of bourgeois society in the crisis of capitalism. The goal of essentially having a society organized around free labor, in which men and women maximally, most efficiently, most productively, through their voluntary cooperation, transform the world around them, was not the goal of ceaseless work. It was the goal of open-ended transformation, right? That one would be able, right, in mastering nature and mastering the labor process and making things maximally efficient and productive, be able, with the least labor, to produce the most and have gainful employment, and that people on the basis of that would be able, through free voluntary cooperation with others, determine the course of their own lives, their own individual lives, and collectively together in society, right? It was the idea of the progressive expansion to all of this kind of modern conception of freedom, that one is not what one always has to be, but may become something beyond oneself, okay? So that idea that bourgeois society is a kind of narrow one, that it's just devoted to work, can miss the point. The goal of such a bourgeois world, of such a bourgeois cosmos, was essentially the maximum amount of collective and individual self-determination, the most productive and efficient work to allow for the other ends of life to open up and potentially infinite transformation. That was the goal and aim of bourgeois society. Now, I have to move on for lack of time, but I will say very quickly, of course, this raises the question of the bourgeois revolution, a category one always hears used. The bourgeois revolution, in some broad sense, comes late. What do I mean it comes late? Well, really, it's in the 16th and early 17th century that many aspects of bourgeois society begin to arise, and bourgeois revolutions do not end traditional society or medieval society or feudal society and bring about bourgeois society. Rather, bourgeois revolutions tend already to be informed by bourgeois society, by people seeing the potentials and possibilities in the development of bourgeois society, and then attempting, right, to master the political order, to realize and unleash those potentials, right? That essentially what's at the core of bourgeois revolution is the realization that civil society is already developing, and that if the state is essentially conquered and turned into a vehicle for the free development of civil society, that is, that the state is used, the state does not view civil society as a means to its own end, but the state views itself, rather, the political order views itself as the means to the ends of the free development of civil society. That's at the core of the bourgeois revolution. And of course, early episodes of the bourgeois revolution are the Dutch Revolt or the Dutch War of Independence in the later 16th and early 17th century, and the English Civil Wars and Revolution of the mid-17th century, the Glorious Revolution of the late 17th century, and then finally the kind of ultimate episode of bourgeois revolution, the ultimate episode of the political subjugation of the state to the free development of civil society, is the great age of revolution that takes place across the North Atlantic world in the later 18th century, the two most famous episodes of which are the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Now, when the bourgeois revolutions take place, they are not revolutions by the bourgeoisie to overthrow some medieval aristocracy, right, or some feudal monarchy and to create bourgeois society. No, quite the contrary. The actors in that view themselves as attempting to save and indeed advance society itself, right? The goal here is to save society itself from what it views as threats against it, whether or not that's an absolute monarch that is seen as becoming despotic or an obstacle, whether that is an aristocracy that is seen as becoming parasitic and an obstacle to development. But at the core of the bourgeois revolutions is the idea initially that society is threatened, this kind of bourgeois society, this society as such that is developed, is threatened and must be defended against enemies, parasites, obstacles, dangers, And in doing so, in defeating those enemies, setting up the possibility for the further development of bourgeois society, for the further development of society as such. And when you look at the actual bourgeois revolutions at any episode, right, they do not make sense in sociological or class terms, right? Often the merchants, the wealthiest merchants, elite merchants, are on the side of the existing status quo. They're doing very well under the absolute monarchy. They're doing very well under the aristocratic oligarchic order, what have you, right? And it is rather what we need to view them as revolts in defense of society by the third estate, by those who work, right? The dawning realization that society is the product of human activity, right? That society is the product of human labor, that humans create through society and labor in society the conditions of their own existence, and that the political order has become a block, an obstacle, a threat to that, and if overthrown, if revolutionized, that process of self-creation can be further developed, can further open up. This is a revolt of the third estate, the revolt of those who work, from often very wealthy merchants and manufacturers and bankers, all the way down to lowly artisan, craftsmen, day laborers, against an order that's seen as an obstacle to society, to the free unfolding and development of labor in society, to the free self-creation of human beings, of their world around them. And the goal or the hope is universal. The idea that you will not install a bourgeoisie in power, but rather you will allow for the free development of a society for all, right? And it's already in the age of revolution that we see aspirations for the end of things that nobody had ever contemplated ending before, right? The end of slavery, right? The end of all varieties, villeinage, serfdom, slavery of unfree labor. The end of 10,000 years of patriarchy, right? Of women having a definite role in the universe. Already is contemplated, there are already advocates of such in the grand age of revolution. Now, to move quickly towards the end, bourgeois society itself comes into contradiction and comes into crisis. What I've tried to encourage you to imagine is effectively that there was going to be a transition away from 10,000 years of traditional civilization based on the ancient conception of freedom towards a kind of new world in which the modern conception of freedom, right, was inhabited and provided to all, that one could become something one is not. But this transition essentially goes into crisis, and we're living with the crisis of that transition. We're living amidst the pathologies strewn about us of that transition. And essentially, bourgeois society enters into self-contradiction and crisis, the society of maximum efficiency, the society of maximum productivity, the society that aimed to reduce work to the minimum extent possible, to make work superfluous, eventually gives rise to the Industrial Revolution. And as one of the great Marxist thinkers of the 20th century, Max Horkheimer, said, the Industrial Revolution made not work, but the workers superfluous. So we live in the self-contradiction and crisis of bourgeois society in capitalism, in the epoch of capital, which is the crisis of transition in and through modern freedom. And in that world, the fundamental constituents of society, the laborers, the workers, have been rendered, to an important degree, increasingly superfluous. And essentially already by the mid-19th century, really early mid-19th century, the 1820s, the 1830s, the 1840s, it was becoming clear that bourgeois society, to many, had entered into crisis and contradiction. Not that its highest aspirations were lies, but rather that its highest aspirations were not being realized, right? That effectively you had around you, if you looked at the scenery of Western Europe in the 1830s and 40s, mass unemployment. That is unthinkable from the perspective of classical political economy, from the perspective of Enlightenment thought about the organization of society, right? That is simply unthinkable. You would have a progressive increase, a division of labor, expansion of the market, reduction of work, increase in consumables and luxuries and products for people to enjoy, right? But instead you have mass and sustaining unemployment. You have a permanent unemployed population. Now, I don't have time to go through all the other manifestations that occur like that, but I want to mention a political one, which is the rise of the socialist workers movement, right? There are aspects of this across the Atlantic world in the early 19th century, but the kind of most famous first form this takes is Chartism in England, which is the most thoroughly industrialized and indeed proletarianized society. Now, what do I mean by proletarianized? I mean the worker, the laborer, the core of bourgeois society, the free laborer, has become proletarianized, has become superfluous. But he is not under the domination of a new feudal lord. The bourgeoisie is not the domination of a new feudal lord. He is under the domination of capital, of a society that he and the activities of other laborers and workers constitute, produce, and reproduce, and that has come into crisis and contradiction, and led to a world historic means-end reversal, where instead of the resources of the past, broadly put because I don't have time, instead of capital, the collective resources of the past being used to emancipate the present and to open up future possibilities that we can't even contemplate. Rather, we devote the present in some important degree to the reproduction of the past, and we foreclose different future possibilities. Capital, instead of being something that serves us, humanity, that is our end, rather we have become the end of capital's self-reproduction and self-valorization. And so the domination of the bourgeois laborer, of the free laborer, rendered superfluous by industrialization and proletarianization, doesn't come from any particular group. We do not live in a caste society. It does not come by an exploiting elite, whether it's an aristocracy or a capitalist class. It comes from society itself, the totality of the self-activity of human beings together, right? Creating and transforming their world in and through society. We dominate ourselves in the epoch of capital, okay? And why am I emphasizing this? Because already many people in the early 19th century realized the bourgeois society is basically, in many respects, negating itself. Or, if I can put it crudely, not living up to its highest ideals and aspirations. And they take different forms. Some people say that's because it was a lie. Really, we all rallied around these capitalists because we're now in the 19th century. We don't just have small merchants and manufacturers. We have vast industrialists and bankers who own massive means of production, subsistence, distribution, and exchange. These capitalists took us, humanity, the workers, under this universal banner, right, to overthrow the old regime and to create this world, but really it was just to empower themselves. But that's not the case at all. The capitalists themselves are also a manifestation of the crisis of bourgeois society. For both the workers, or the proletariat of the 19th century, and the capitalist class come from the third estate. They were both people who lived by their work, their industry, their enterprise. They were not noble of birth and blood. They were not nobility, and they were not priests. They were not blessed with divinity and taking on sacred ointments and sacred robes. They were not the first and second estate. They were the vast majority of humanity, the third estate, those who work, who were consigned to live outside of history, to not be in the chronicles of the world, rather to simply be beasts of burden, right, who produced society that other people enjoyed, right? But what's happened now, the third estate has revolted, right, in the kind of great age of revolution of the late 18th century. But because bourgeois society, that those revolts both came out of but helped advance, has entered into self-contradiction and crisis, the third estate itself has essentially split now by the 19th century into capitalist and proletariat, into capital and labor, right? But I want to stress to you that this is a manifestation of a crisis of society as a whole. Not because there was some group that was really behind the bourgeois revolutions that then became the dominating force over society that is exploiting people, if that makes sense. And essentially, there were many ways to approach these things. It's a lie, it's not true, we're dominated by the bourgeoisie in the way our ancestors were dominated by the aristocracy, or to be romantics, that this whole world of self-production and self-transformation is a horrible world, and we should go back to a more organic, right, all-encompassing world in which men and women produce themselves in definite practices towards definite ends, and nothing was open-ended and potentially transformable. But Marx and Engels are essentially, right, the philosophers of a Second Enlightenment because they attempt to make sense of what's going on, the crisis of bourgeois society. Okay? That is what they're doing, and there's a kind of gospel or good news according to Marx and Engels. While bourgeois society has entered into crisis and contradiction, the development of the capitalist mode of production actually opens up the possibility of going even beyond bourgeois society, meaning the development of capitalism, the development of the epoch of capital suggests not simply that labor can be reduced, but that it may be transcended altogether. That the world in which you must work in order to live is not necessary, or may one day be unnecessary, if the forces of production that have been brought into existence can be used for humanity's ends of collective and individual development and freedom. So Marx and Engels are talking about the crisis of bourgeois society in capitalism, which is the self-contradiction of bourgeois society, and not just simply talking about removing an obstacle, but seeing a possibility for going even beyond bourgeois society, the society of labor, in new vistas, new avenues of transformation we cannot even imagine, right? Because bourgeois still thought, right, or believed very strongly the world would be organized around free labor, that one must work in order to live. We may be able to go beyond that altogether into forms of activity we can't even imagine. And the great principle, what Marx famously said was his only original thought, the dictatorship of the proletariat, right, was simply about having the socialist workers' movement politicize bourgeois society in crisis in capitalism, to politicize society, to open up to political democratic deliberation and conflict and debate, the possibility of facing this crisis of bourgeois society, of facing the epoch of capital, and to begin thinking about how one might be able to overcome this, to master this, to transform it, and to open up new possibilities of freedom that the Enlightenment never dared dreamed of. And I'll just conclude with this. I know I've gone over time, I apologize. I grew up on kind of Star Trek: The Next Generation. It has the problems of a lot of science fiction. You know, a lot of people point this out, which is science fiction is often just the present with a bit more toys and gadgets and costumes. But there are episodes occasionally where these forms of spirit, these forms of becoming, these forms of life they come across are just so mysterious to them and beyond them. It might be not simply that humanity is, well, it is the case that humanity is tasked with overcoming capitalism, with overcoming the self-contradiction and crisis of bourgeois society, but it might also be the case that humanity is tasked with overcoming itself altogether, with giving rise to new forms of spirit and new forms of becoming that we can't even see possible. Some kind of merger with inorganic life or other forms of organic life, transformation of consciousness. I mean, I'm not going to get into artificial intelligence and all that. That's beyond my pay grade. But we may give rise to entirely other forms of life that will not be explicable in terms of the human. So why do I say this? Because I just want to leave you at the end with the sensibility and imagination that so profound was the transformation in human community of the Neolithic Revolution and the move from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agriculturists. So profound was the rise of bourgeois society and the transformation of human community. And so profound is this pathology, this crisis of transition into something else that we live through. And we have to realize that what may lie up beyond it is not just simply the overcoming of capitalism, but the overcoming even of us, humanity. And so I will leave that there, and we'll stay here for any of your questions. And I apologize for going a few minutes over and trespassing on your time. Yes.
So what would you say? So you said it's not to blame like the formation of I guess the deformation of the bourgeois society into like a deformed place. It's all about like we are being segregated to capital. But normally when we think about this kind of thing, it is the idea that there's some sort of capital owning class that has been just oppressing the people. How do we like really resist the tendency? Because I think very easily we just go into that default mode, thinking there's the oppressor and there's the oppressee.
That's very good. I mean, in some sense, obviously that's a longer conversation, but just to try to tie it back to the presentation, the forms of transformation of human community that take place from nomadic hunter-gathering to settled agriculture to bourgeois society that may yet take place again after the crisis of bourgeois society are so profound and that they tend to transform our entire understanding of the world, right? Meaning, if we were to go back, I'm just going to use the example of Europe because it's the one I'm most familiar with. If we go back and look at medieval Europe from our vantage point of bourgeois society in crisis, what that looks like to us is this. There are all these peasants. They're doing all the work. They're the ones working in agriculture. They're producing the surplus that the priests, the Roman Catholic priesthood, and that the aristocracy, the nobility live off of. Because we look back from the vantage point of a transvaluation of values. For most of human history, labor was denigrated. Human labor was denigrated. It was dirty. It was awful. You weren't supposed to do it, right? It was useless. That people, the good, the virtuous, the true people were those who didn't labor. The nobility, the priestly caste. They did other things beyond labor. And bourgeois society, and within it the bourgeois revolution, carries out this transvaluation of values where labor comes to be an essential value. It's valorized and not denigrated. And suddenly, an aristocracy like happens in the French Revolution that was understood to be noble of birth and these grand, splendid displays for the peasants to look up to, now becomes seen as a giant parasite, right? Oh, these people don't work. Labor, free labor is the central value, and these people do not work, right? They rather steal the labor or live off the labor of others, right? That is a profound, I'm using Nietzsche's term, but I think it gets at transvaluation of values. We can't help but look back from bourgeois society and the epoch of capital which we live in, which is bourgeois society in crisis, and look back and basically kind of think of the aristocracy as essentially, and the priestly caste, of exploiting the peasants, right? But if we had some ability to capture, right, the mindset of medieval Christendom, people did not think in those terms, right? Peasants did not think in the Middle Ages that they were exploited by the nobility and the priestly caste, and this is just well documented. When peasants revolt, they are not asking for an end of feudalism or an end of serfdom. They are asking for better conditions of feudalism and serfdom. Unless you think I'm joking, I mean, you can all go look this up. One of the greatest peasant revolts in the Middle Ages takes place in England in 1381. And essentially the entire ruling class, the entire feudal ruling class, is captured and cornered in London by this great peasant rebellion. And all the peasants want to negotiate with the king and the lords is essentially better conditions for what we would view as their enslavement or their enserfment, their unfree labor. Right? That's all they want to do. They don't want to break feudalism. They don't see it as a form of labor exploitation, or they're producing a surplus. So why am I saying all this? Because it's inevitable from the vantage point of bourgeois society that looks like stolen labor, that looks, right, like exploitation, if that makes sense. And so I do think it becomes inevitable. It's a form, if you will, of necessary misrecognition that we think of the capitalists, right, as an equivalent type of exploitation. Right? That essentially their fabulous wealth is based on our exploitation rather than on our self-domination. That we have basically created this society, and this society has entered into crisis and contradiction. And our best bet is to try and think about how we, through our own activity, create and recreate this society and how we might change it. And I mean this, the dictatorship of the proletariat is not some ominous, party bureaucracy running things. The dictatorship of the proletariat is just to try and make that a question, right? Just to make that a question. For all of our freedom, for all of our emancipation, we have a society strewn with pathologies, unemployment, right? A whole series of things. How would we politicize that? How would we open up the possibility, right, of trying collectively to transform the society. It's just the beginning of that process, right? Now, yes, is it the fact that capitalists will oppose such a thing? Perhaps violently, and therefore in response to that, the socialist workers movement will also have to use violence to protect itself and advance its cause? Sure, right? And there's always been propaganda and rhetoric about that as the capitalists as the exploiters. But if we are successfully, if we're able to remove the capitalists, right, if there are no capitalists, we're still confronted with the problem of our own self-constituted domination. Meaning you can take all the capitalists away, right? As Horkheimer puts it, their problem is they enjoy the world as it is, right? Okay, so they don't have an interest in transforming it, right? It's not that they're somehow bad people or something like that. So I would say it's a necessary form of misrecognition. Just in the way we can't help but look back at medieval Europe and say those peasants are being exploited by the priests and lords in a way that they never would have understood at all. They were part of Christendom. They were a part of great chain of being. They were working in the order of the universe God had placed them in, and they would someday be received through Christ into God, right? And none of this would matter. This just passing through a veil darkly, right? This passing through, a veil of tears, right, etc. And so we can't help but think to some degree of the capitalist class as the exploiters, right? And if that makes sense. But even removing them, we would still have to be faced with the possibility of a social organization that has come to dominate us, right? And another way of thinking about this, if I can put it this way, and I can unpack it, but I won't now because I see there are other questions, is that we still adjudicate the world in 18th century terms. It's not that that's wrong, because we still live in bourgeois society. I'm sure many of you, I assume most of you are Chicago undergraduates, so you will be exposed to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, right? That term makes sense, right? That makes sense. We still live in bourgeois society. But the 19th century happened, right? We live in bourgeois society as if though the 19th and 20th century didn't happen. That is, bourgeois society entered into crisis and contradiction. So if the socialist workers movement, right, or if radical left possibilities simply manifest themselves solely along terms of exploitation, right, that someone is stealing from me or I'm not getting the value of their labor, they are likely to reproduce the world as it is, right? Now, not in the exact same form, meaning they are likely to give rise to new forms of capitalist organization. But those capitalist political and economic organizations will simply be ways of managing the ever-present crisis and contradiction of bourgeois society. They will not be ways of transforming it. And the goal of the dictatorship of the proletariat is try and open up the possibility of not simply managing the ever-recurring crisis and contradiction of bourgeois society, but actually overcoming it, if that makes sense. There were other, oh, sorry, I don't know whose hand was up first. We'll go, and then we'll go to you, sir. Yeah.
You go ahead.
So what do you think is the role of Marxism in today's politics? Are there any particular political party of any country that actually have a platform that's similar to Marx's ideal of politics?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't mean this. I mean, Platypus, I should say, is not such a party at all. We're simply a self-education group, right? No, I mean, I'm not hiding anything. This is literally, this activity we have now is the core of our enterprise, right? To try and educate ourselves about classical Marxism. And in doing that, it's not that we don't do anything that I think is of interest, meaning often a lot of what has to be done is bringing out the esoteric content of classical Marxism, taking the assumptions they make and no longer just taking them for granted, but saying, here are their assumptions, right? Saying, we need to now, because we live long after the failure and defeat of Marxism, we have to explain the assumptions it made in the way they never would have needed to, right, etc. No, but I don't think there's such a party today or anything like that. I mean, I don't know how else to put this, but yeah.
Yes. Okay, yeah. So you bring up the contingency of the origin of capital, and all these different things that we can't understand as a single structuralist thing. We can't understand the origin of capital, I guess, as a product of the imminent contradictions of feudalism. How do we understand the origin of capital as a totality? Is that possible?
Sorry, can I just make sure the first part of the question, you're saying, did you say we can or we can't understand?
I'm asking if it's So in your discussion on the origin of capital, you highlight the contingencies, all these different weird things that had to happen, not as a product of imminent contradictions within like caste society.
That's right.
But historical developments that could or could not happen. Is it possible to understand the origin of capital as a totality in like any sort of structuralist way, or are we sort of stuck with looking at it through contingent?
So I would answer that by saying a kind of modified yes. Let me explain what I mean by that, which is to reassert this distinction between bourgeois society and capitalism. That is, capitalism is the crisis of bourgeois society. What I was saying is not that we can't understand the origins of capitalism with regard to a logic of development. I was trying to understand we can't understand the origins of bourgeois society with regard to a logic of development. That is to say, I think we can retrospectively look back from our vantage point of capitalism and realize that it comes out of a crisis and contradiction of bourgeois society, an inherent potentiality in bourgeois society. In a way, I have to extremely crudely truncate here that maximizing efficiency and productivity might eventually bring about such a great transformation, right, that it's not humans that really do the work anymore, but machines and technology. And thus might create or make possible a world that human beings in classical bourgeois society, I'm talking the 17th, 18th century, could not imagine, which is a world beyond labor, right? Because if you think, Marx has this line on Adam Smith. Well, so go back to your question. So I would say the following. You cannot have a trans-historical logic of development. That is, that while Marx and Engels, particularly look at the Communist Manifesto, have a retrospective account that is viewed from the vantage point of their present, which is the first half of the 19th century, which is bourgeois society having entered into contradiction and crisis with itself, you can look back on the whole of human history, right, and talk about class struggle. You can retrospectively from the present project back onto the past. But I don't think when one unpacks the underlying assumptions of their philosophy of history, that they believe there was an imminent logical development, or however you want to term it, within feudalism that necessarily gave rise to bourgeois society, right? And in fact, when you look at their own kind of accounts, there's an emphasis on a great deal of contingency. They're not saying there's some, I'll just give an example. I forget his name, maybe it's Guy Bois. He was a French Marxist economist in the post-war period, maybe the 60s, 70s. Anyway, this is boring. He wanted to say, there's some problem with the way feudal agriculture works in the surplus. It runs up against something like a crisis of profitability. Really, he doesn't call it that, but like a crisis of surplus extraction. And that has to lead to this move towards free labor and all of this other stuff. I mean, no, I don't think that Marx and Engels, and certainly classical Marxism as a whole, thought of it as that kind of a logical development. So bourgeois society it emerges out of a series of contingencies, right? It is not inherently necessary out of feudalism. But I don't think you can understand it. I don't think you can understand the fact that bourgeois society emerges at a time and place that is in the North Atlantic world between the 16th and 18th centuries without understanding what plays out in that world before bourgeois society emerged. So to talk about the origins of bourgeois society, one would have to have recourse to some account of feudalism. But that doesn't mean, and its crisis and collapse, but that doesn't mean that feudalism had a logic within it that inevitably, in a teleological sense, would lead towards the development of bourgeois society. What I do think we can say is this bourgeois society, which is, if I can put it in these terms, a kind of grand world historic transition, right, from ancient freedom to this modern freedom, right, that is kind of in crisis now. The transition is incomplete and it's in crisis with the development of capitalism. We can say that there was a definite potentiality within bourgeois society for it entering into contradiction and crisis, for it giving rise to capitalism. The reason for that being is and this is crude, we can talk maybe after in a broader sense, but maximizing productivity and efficiency eventually opened up the possibility not simply of human labor, of living labor, right, creating wealth, but a possibility of non-human labor, right, of creating wealth altogether. And that possibility could open up the transcendence of human labor and the necessity of human labor in the way it existed under bourgeois society altogether. But instead, in Horkheimer's pithy formulation, instead of rendering work superfluous, it rendered the workers superfluous. That is, the Industrial Revolution, the full coming into being of the capitalist mode of production, and the proletarianization of society. So, I mean, but one can absolutely see that that is a possible potential development within bourgeois society. The only thing I would say to that, now it might seem that I'm constantly contradicting myself, the reason why I give you a modified yes is, if the socialist workers movement, which arose, right, as that crisis and contradiction of bourgeois society was developing in the early 19th century, had successfully taken power or constituted a dictatorship of the proletariat, had politicized, right, the crisis of bourgeois society, had made it subject to politics and a potential attempt by human deliberation and debate to transform it, then we may have never had to live through the epoch of capital, or only briefly, right? We may have never existed whatsoever, if that makes sense. So, in that sense, maybe capitalism is not at all, right, a necessary potential development out of bourgeois society. That a move from bourgeois society in crisis to something beyond it completely may have been, and indeed I would argue that Marx and Engels think it was a definite possibility as of the mid to later 19th century. That all of the course of history has been unfortunate in the later 19th and 20th century, right? That the epoch of, right, a large-scale capitalism, of monopoly capitalism, of world empires, of states armed to the teeth, of all of the kind of alibis for the pathologies of capitalism that developed, like racism and sexism, and all of those things was unnecessary, right? That it was absolutely unnecessary. Yes?
Question. So what is the path forward? So you warned against, political action with a focus on eliminating exploitation, and that would just reproduce some other bourgeois contradiction. I was wondering, I don't know, what is the path forward to making a society with unimaginable means of, living like you described? What can we do and what are you trying to do? Like, I don't know, what does one do to get to that place?
Well, the most honest answer to that is I don't know. What I do know is that what made me aware of thinking that I live in this kind of epoch, this kind of moment in the history of humanity, was classical Marxism. And it tried basically to lay out a way forward. And so my goal, and this is why I'm a member of Platypus, which is an educational group, is to try and best understand what classical Marxism was, what its own self-understanding was, which involves interrogating it, but also having to interrogate its assumptions to try and make it as coherent as possible, if that makes sense. So the simple truth is, and I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you, I don't know the way forward. I do know that the kind of consciousness I have of being at a certain moment in human history, right, comes from classical Marxism, and that classical Marxism did try and point a way forward, right? That is the organized socialist workers movement constituting the dictatorship of the proletariat, politicizing society, and opening up the possibility of overcoming the social relations we currently live within. And so I seek to best understand it and its assumptions, if that makes sense. But I don't have a way forward. And by the way, I did not mean to dismiss people's discontents. Like if we think of the left today, or any group or discontents, I didn't mean to dismiss it and suggest, oh, people are just silly people who reproduce bourgeois society in crisis. They reproduce capitalism. Meaning any kind of political movement would have to begin with those discontents. There isn't some royal road where we can skip over the world we inhabit, right? Because this capitalism, the crisis of bourgeois society, exists. We really constitute and reconstitute, produce it and reproduce it every day. We can't just press a button and skip over it, right? We're doing something, right, that we are insufficiently aware of, insufficiently masters over, that we have to try and seek, right, to overcome, if that makes sense. And the only way to do that is obviously beginning with the world as it is, right? We have to start here to have any potential to go there, right? And Marxism is what is an attempt to tell us at least the first steps by no means the end point. Marxism is not prefigurative. I mean, if you take seriously what I said, and whether or not you do, it's up to you, but if you take seriously what I said, Marxism could not know what the world beyond capitalism would look like, right? Marxism could not possibly know that, right? And the classical Marxists are very clear that the dictatorship of the proletariat and the beginnings of socialism is a world of bourgeois right, of living more or less according to the values and rules and standards that we do now, right? But made consciously political and subject to deliberation, debate, and potential transformation beyond it. So my very simple answer to your question is, I don't know a way forward. I'm not trying to dismiss those discontents, though. Like you rightfully said, well, you're just saying this is going to reproduce capitalism or bourgeois society in crisis. But we would have to begin with those. We would have to begin with those and ask ourselves, okay, why do we have these? Is it because there's a lie? Is it because we're exploited by another class? Is it because, the state, the anarchist answer, the state, the bodies of armed men, the bureaucracy, the military, etc., they're the fault. Or many socialists, the fault really is just the capitalist class, right? There are these answers, right? And they may or may not be persuasive. There are these answers. To my mind, Marxism gives me a means to try and adjudicate that kind of stuff and to think about, what would be such a way forward. But no, I don't have one at all. So I'm sorry that I don't have a kind of ready-made answer to that kind of project. Yeah. The point of all of this, and I realize probably, Desmond, we're at time, right? So I'll just say this. The point of all of this is not to suggest that Marxism has the answers. I really think the truth of it is you have to be open to the possibility that Marxism is wrong. You just have to. You can't live in 2021 and not be open to that possibility, right? Anything else is just purely dogmatic, right? Even if you read these texts and you find them incredibly persuasive and they explain the world to you and the possibilities of the world better or more plausibly than others, you would still have to remain open to the possibility that they're wrong, right? And all I'm asking of you guys, if you do choose to explore Marxism more, is do not let all of the layers of the past that have developed, right, that say Marxism is this or that, or Marxism is this or that, all of the kind of assumptions about Marxism is this, do not take that stuff for granted, right? Go out there and actually read the classical texts of Marxism. Read the texts of bourgeois philosophy and thought, radical bourgeois philosophy and thought, that they were based on, that are the fundamental assumptions from which they are working, right? So many people want to tell you Marxism is X, Y, and Z. But the truth is, when most people say that, they're really not offering you Marxism, they're offering you some variety of anti-Marxism. Okay? Most of the left today is offering you varieties of anti-Marxism. Okay? And so all I'm saying is if Marxism does interest you, however you come about it or become interested in it, right, go back and read the texts of classical Marxism. By classical Marxism, I mean the trajectory between Marx and Engels from the 1840s through to the era of World War I and the so-called Second Internationals of Lenin and Luxemburg, and then the kind of attempt to preserve their memory under transformed conditions by groups of Marxists like Trotskyists and the Frankfurt School, etc. And I really think the Platypus Reading Group is the best possible way of trying to understand what Marxism was, to make sense of it, by both reading those texts and discussing them themselves, but also reading the assumptions on which they're based. Radical bourgeois thought and philosophy like Rousseau and Smith and Kant and Hegel, etc. Okay? And so be open to the possibility that Marxism is wrong, but before you conclude it's right or wrong, actually encounter Marxism. Don't encounter the kind of self-delusions which go by the name of Marxism. And these people really do think they're Marxists, but they're usually incredibly anti-Marxist, right? Most of the left today is extremely anti-Marxist. And I'm saying this to you dogmatically. I'd be happy to talk about it in more specific details afterwards. But most of the left is basically devoted towards either avoiding Marxism altogether or suggesting that Marxism is wrong. And even the Marxists, they're the ones that do it the worst. So what I would say is before you decide if Marxism is right or wrong, educate yourself in Marxism, but recognize if you go to an existing left political movement out there, you're likely to be miseducated in Marxism. So you can't properly adjudicate it whether or not it's right or wrong or it's for you. That's all. Okay, thanks guys, I appreciate it.